All right, we're going to go and get started. Make sure we're uh, valuing everybody's time and honoring time boundaries. A few announcements before I do the introduction for our speaker. I'm going to be posting in the chat links to a handout that goes with today's presentation, a link to the MHA Spartanburg website, where soon you'll be able to see our lineup of speakers for next year. We're working on finalizing that, and we will be transitioning to a hybrid model next year where we're able to have virtual and in-person attendance, and you'll be able to get more information about that on the website. It'll be forthcoming as we finalize it. Please consider donating to MHA Spartanburg if you're able to. It allows us to host events like this and provide these types of services to the community at no cost. And there are options for donating online if that's your preference. We also are going to link to our Facebook page so that you can stay up to date on what we have coming down the pipeline. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Mitch Killinen. Dr. Mitch grew up in northern Minnesota. He attended the University of Minnesota Seminary at Cantor School of Theology at Emory University. He did graduate studies at the University of Dubuque. I told him I was going to mess it up, and I did. At the University of Dubuque in Iowa, Boston University, and Andover Newton Theological School in Boston. He's a retired United Methodist minister, having served almost 40 years as a pastor and pastoral counselor. Dr. Killinen was director of the Methodist Counseling Center in Spartanburg for 22 years, where he conducted marital and family therapy. And prior to retiring, he was duly licensed as an LMFT and LPC in South Carolina. He's been married for 60 years to his wife, Carol. They have 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren. They also had a son, Mitchell, who died in 2007 at the age of 38. And Mitchell is part of what Dr. Killinen is going to be speaking to us about today as he discusses his experience with the grieving process. I'll go back to him at the end, so feel free to drop questions you have in the chat. If there are any problems, technical, volume, anything like that, please drop that in the chat as well, and we'll try to attend to it. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him. Get your mic turned on.
Well, folks, this is a great day not to be out and about and doing this presentation by Zoom. I want to say hi to Mary Knight. I understand she's in the Zoom audience. She's a member of my church, Central Methodist, and member of my Sunday school class. I want to back up Ross's request for financial support for MHA. You know, the most often told lie is my check is in the mail. Well, Ross and my audience, my check is in the mail. I sent my MHA donation last week. I hope they got it. Now, a couple of disclaimers. Technology makes me nervous, but Ross has calmed me down. Secondly, my wife Carol fell and broke her hip Saturday and had a total hip replacement Sunday. She's home now, getting some help at home and doing well. But if I look tired or act sluggish, you will understand. I'd like to dedicate this presentation to a dear friend named Marion Norman. Marion died suddenly on July 15th at the age of 79. She was a longtime supporter of mental health efforts, and in fact worked as an employee of MHA under the guidance of Mary Miles. So I keep her in mind during this presentation. This is not going to be your typical academic kind of presentation. As Ross told you, I'm going to be talking mostly about the death of our son and some things I learned from that. Here's kind of my grief history. My dad died in 1983 from lung cancer. My mom died in 2008 from kidney failure. Uh, my wife's brother died in that same year, 2008, and her mother died in 2010. So here's the Mitchell story. When he was 3 years old, he was diagnosed with Marfan syndrome, which is a rare muscle disease. We were living in Boston at the time, and we were told he would not live past his 20s. Uh, I went into immediate grief thinking about that until one day my therapist said, "Why are you grieving about a son who's still with you?" Which was a kind of a turning point because it guided me to love and appreciate the son that was going to be with me for many years. My wife and I worried, though. There was a constant cloud hanging over us uh, about this Marfan's because death usually is caused by an aortic dissection. So back to 2007, we were at a Christmas party and we got a call from our daughter that Mitchell, who was working as an assistant to the youth pastor at Lyman United Methodist Church, had gone into cardiac arrest, and the ambulance was taking him to Spartanburg Regional Hospital. And of course, we were anxious and in shock and went to the hospital. And we're in the waiting area for a few minutes. And then they took us up to the family room. Well, as a longtime pastor, I know what that family room means. It means they're going to come and tell you bad news. So the doctor and a nurse came and into that room and told us that Mitchell had died. I immediately screamed, "No, no, no," uh, and grabbed hold of my middle granddaughter, Morgan, and just sobbed and sobbed. This was on December 21st. It was near Christmas. And his service, his funeral service, was on Christmas Eve. So you might understand that Christmas Eves in the years that followed were very, very difficult for us. One thing I remember from his funeral service is my twin brother, uh, who died in 2010 since then, was flying from Minnesota. And there was a blizzard at the Minneapolis St. Paul airport. So he got into the service late. He didn't have time to change clothes. He was in blue jeans and a jacket. And when I saw him, I ran up the aisle and hugged him and started crying and said, "My precious boy is gone." The other thing that I remember was that a member of my church, a man named Bob Rao, coming through that receiving line at church, had tears in his eyes. And that meant so much to me that it wasn't about anything he would say or words, but that he connected with my grief. I was also impressed that Mitchell's cardiologist came to the funeral service, which I think was kind of a rare thing. Now, in the months ahead, a year or two ahead after Mitchell's death, we were very hesitant to go into his room. He had a lot of electronic stuff in there and TVs and stereos and had a lot of books. So that was kind of our sad room. We just weren't able to go in there much until about, well, maybe 4 years later. Our daughter came from Virginia, and we started clearing out things and um, making that into kind of a den. And so after some years, we didn't think of it as the grief room. We thought of it as the comfort room because it reminded of our life with Mitchell. Friends would come by the house in the months that followed, and I would talk with them about Mitchell and would tear up. I didn't cry hard or anything, just teared up. Uh, so let's move on from there. Uh, there are no shortcuts to dealing with grief. It's a process. And you can Google and get all kinds of papers and books on grief. Uh, but it's not an intellectual process. So I think what's more helpful is what I'm doing with you today is to, if you're going to read something, read books of people who've been through a grief process and can share that with you. Most of you probably know the classic book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on death and dying. That's been out a long time, probably from the 70s. Uh, you know this: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. I would add one other part to her scheme, which is shock, which might well be part of her denial phase. And people were saying, we said in the early days, I can't believe Mitchell's gone. I just can't believe it. I think it was just a few weeks after Mitchell's death, we had the family over, my daughter and her husband and three granddaughters. And I wasn't aware of any anger at God. A lot of people get angry at God and ask why. Uh, but I couldn't get my granddaughters to put their cell phones up. And we were eating dinner, and I just stood up from the table and stormed out. And my 11-year-old granddaughter, Taylor, said, Mom, is that the anger stage? So that's a pretty well-known kind of thing. Kind of an interest, well, I don't know if you'd find it interesting. A footnote to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I always wondered how a psychiatrist could go into a hospital room of a terminally ill patient and get them to talk to her. Well, maybe 30 years ago or so, there was a convention of the American Association of Pastoral Counselors in Chicago. I'm sure Jim Rentz was there as well. And we learned that the way she got an entree into those patients is by going with the hospital chaplain, whose name was Carl Neiswanger. And we learned that from his daughter, Bonnie. So I think she couldn't have gone in just cold turkey, because when you're facing death, many people are comfortable with a pastor or a chaplain. Now, no one grieves by standard stages. It's not linear. It may be elliptical, it may be spiral, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But it's helpful to know what stages you might be facing. Here are some comments which I think are not helpful. People get very anxious about how to relate to a person who's lost a loved one. And I say, I don't know what to say. Well, here are some things you should not say. It's God's will. Now, I know that's the belief of some religious people, but don't say to the parents of a 6-year-old child 2 days after the death, it's God's will, because they are in deep grief and shock. And I think that is not comforting. Another thing we've learned in church is God will not give you more than you can bear. And I don't think that's true. Sometimes you can't bear some things, like the loss of a child. I was counseling a woman years ago who lost her husband, and her two aunts, who were twins, died on the same day. Her daughter died with MS, and she'd always been taught this: God will not give you more than you can bear. But it didn't help her. She had more than she could bear, especially in the early stages. Here's a biggie. I know how you feel. No, you don't. Sometimes I'll write a note, a card to some grieving person, and let's say they've lost a child as I have, and I will say simply, I think I might have an inkling of what you're dealing with. My sister Penny was a junior high English teacher, and she loved poetry. So when my dad died, she had this put on his gravestone: Earth knows no sorrow that heaven cannot heal. Well, that's a very sentimental and comforting kind of phrase. But some people aren't going to feel that God's going to heal that. Here's another one that's common. She's in a better place. Well, that might be true in 6 months or a year, but not in the minutes and the hours and days following the death of a loved one. Now, with my dear friend Marion, she had been diagnosed with ALS maybe 2 weeks before her death. And the family was just dreading those cruel years ahead that were going to just deplete her completely. So I did say to her husband, who's a good friend of mine, I think death was merciful for her, not for you guys who've lost you, but for her. I would also recommend you not say to a person in the early days of grieving, are you okay? Nobody's okay after losing a loved one. Now, it's well intended. I think it really means I care about you, but literally they're not okay. I was going to Sunday school maybe 6 or 8 months after Mitchell died, and walking down the hall, and a member of the class stopped me in the hall and said, are you okay? Now, I'm a Minnesotan. Midwesterners don't say I'm fine. I said, no, I'm not okay. My son died. And he said, well, if you're not over this yet, you need to get in therapy. And boy, that did make me mad. I didn't say anything. He was just checking on me. And please don't say, please don't cry. Because crying is one of the biggest parts of healing. Now, with grief, you can pay now or pay later. You can grieve early on, days, weeks, and months. You can put a lid on it and hold it together. But often, some smaller grief years or later, maybe the death of a pet, will trigger that unresolved grief. And then that smaller grief will raise that up to consciousness. And a person will wonder why they're grieving so deeply for their dog. Unresolved grief can also lead to physical illness. I've read some studies where deep grief that's unresolved uh, can deplete the immune system enough that people get cancer or other kinds of illnesses. And Ross, you be my timekeeper. Don't let me run over. There's such a thing as anniversary depression. And my wife and I have experienced that. Every Christmas or Christmas Eve, we're remembering what happened 15 years ago. I remember a man who came to me for counseling. He said, every September, I get depressed for several weeks. And after talking with him, I discovered that both of his parents had died when he was a teenager. I think it was a car accident. And so that anniversary always activated this depression. And so we moved on from there in therapy to dealing with his grief. Now, what about medication for someone who's grieving? Uh, I think that's a sticky business because if you get on antidepressants and they put a lid on your emotions, they're not dealt with. But if your grief gets to clinical depression, I think an antidepressant probably would be helpful. I had a psychiatrist who was my consultant years ago when I was the director of the counseling center, and I'd go to him getting feedback about a patient, and I'd say, is this clinical depression or is it situation? And he looked at me and said, what do you think? Why do you think it can't be both? Dummy. My wife reacted differently than I. She stayed up in bed a lot and eventually got on antidepressants, but she'd complain and say, I can't cry. Uh, and so that's a balancing act. I did the typical male thing, and of course the Scandinavian male thing. Uh, I just worked harder and faster, as though I could outrun grief. In my pastoral counseling course in seminary, one of the things I remember is our professor said, avoid two extremes. Do not create a shrine. Keep the room exactly like it was for years. Or the other extreme is get rid of all the clothes and the shoes and athletic equipment and whatever. But some kind of medium place in between. Now, several books regarding grief. I mentioned earlier that reading what someone else has gone through, I think, can be helpful. Kirk Neely's been a pastor and pastoral counselor in Spartanburg for many, many years. He lost his son, uh, Chris, many years ago. Uh, Kirk says he's not lost, he's in heaven, but I lost my son when he died. But Kirk wrote a book that was helpful, and it's called When Grief Comes, Finding Strength for Today and Hope for Tomorrow. And of course, you'd understand that that's from a pastor's perspective. Uh, One of the things he said in his book was, don't isolate yourself. Carol and I went into a cocoon, I think, for about 6 months. We didn't go to church or go out much. Friends would come by and visit with us, and we'd talk. Many of you may know the writings of C.S. Lewis, and one of his books is called A Grief Observed. He had married an American woman named Joy. He has a book about her called Surprised by Joy, but this is the book that I refer to, A Grief Observed. Some of you may remember a book called Tuesdays with Morrie. It was authored by Mitch Albom. He actually started out as a sports writer, and he would go and visit Morrie, who was terminally ill. And I have a quote from that book. Morrie said to Mitch Albom at one point, don't want to leave this world in a state of fright. I want to know what's happening, accept it, get to a peaceful place, and let go. A book that's been helpful to me is called Lament for a Son by Nicholas Walterstorff, because it does talk about his son who was only in his 20s when he died. And then there's a book called Five Cries of Grief by Martin and Irene Stroman. Now, what I often see with families as a pastor and counselor, and even with my own experience, is that we think we're protecting the family members by not ever mentioning the name of the deceased person or even bringing up the subject. Or we'll say, I'm afraid I'll make her sad. Well, that mom or that wife or that grandmother's already sad. So you're not making them sad. You're inviting them to share if they feel up to that. There's a lady in our church whose son died about the same time that our son Mitchell died. And I call Pat on April 6th every year, and we talk about her son. That was his birthday. I mentioned this before. People say, I don't know what to say. In fact, with the death of my friend Mary, and another church member said, I don't know what to say. And I said, this is hard to do. I said, just be there. Just be present. You don't have to say anything. And it reminded me of an extreme example of this from years ago. A chaplain in a mental hospital in Wichita, Kansas, had a catatonic patient who would just sit out in the courtyard, not in the winter, of course, on a bench. And the chaplain would go and sit there for 30 minutes and then leave. There was no conversation. And about 5 years later, this patient thanked him for being there. Now, what will help us survive this? along with some of the things I've mentioned. People say time heals all things. That is not my experience. I think time will help, will take the edge off of the pain of grief, but it will not make it all go away. My pain and my wife's pain is not the same as it was on Christmas Eve in 2007. It's manageable. We, in a sense, have survived and healed over the years. What else can help? Well, here's a brilliant suggestion uh, for me as a well trained pastor and therapist. Talk and cry, Ross, talk and cry, talk and cry. Now, not everybody can do that. Uh, I think men have more trouble with that than women, which is a sexist statement, but I think it might be true. A long time ago, people would hire women called keeners who would come to the funeral service and do the crying for them. They'd actually wail. We had a director of Christian education at Central from Romania, and when her mom died, they still did this in Romania a few years ago. The keeners would wail on behalf of the family. Uh, I'm not recommending that, you understand. I think you need to do your own grief process. Regarding men, there's a Minnesota poet called Robert Bly who wrote a book called Iron John. And he had retreats for men where they'd go out in the wilderness and he'd try and help men get in touch with their feelings. Uh, he said, three things men have trouble saying are, I can't, I hurt, I need. There's an example from this in Pat Conroy's book, The Prince of Tides. It was made into a movie with Barbara Streisand in it. And the brother of Luke, who had been killed, went to New York City to see his sister, who was in deep, deep depression under the care of a psychiatrist played by Barbara Streisand. And he was there just to see how the sister's therapy was going. But one day, Barbara Streisand said to him, why don't you talk about Luke, who was shot and killed? And he said, well, talking about him won't bring him back. But Barbara Streisand's character said, no, but it might bring you back. Love. Love will help you through, along with some of these other things. Love of family. Robert Fulghum wrote a book years ago called Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And one of the things he said was, when you are in a strange place, hold hands and stick together. So group support, I think, is really, really helpful. That group support might be friends. We were in a Wednesday night spiritual growth group that met on Wednesday nights for about 30 years. And that group held our hands in the midst of our grief process. That was really, really helpful. It may be your local church. Might be your Sunday school class. I remember a few days after Mitchell died, Carol's best friend Mary, and I mentioned her earlier, came to the house, and she had a cup of coffee just like Carol liked it. And another church friend was there and told us later, I wish I had a friend like that. Now, for those who have faith in God, which is not everybody, uh, the assurance of her presence can be a comfort. We are not promised to be spared from grief, only that God is with us. Now, if grief persists for a long time without any relief, individual or group therapy is helpful. Sometimes grief can become pathological. It can make us sick. So in conclusion of those remarks of mine, this is a quote from the book I mentioned, from Five Cries of Grief. And I like this very much. The black stone of grief miraculously grows smooth with our long handling of it. Now, Ross, how's our time?
We're at 12:38. We got about 10 or 12 more minutes if you'd like to go, if you have anything else, or I can open for questions.
I don't need to go over this handout. Ross is going to send that to you. It's some practical things, kind of like what I've been talking about. Ross will send that to you. And so now we have time for some questions or comments or reflections.
Mitch, are there any particular homework assignments or activities that you found helpful with the clients you were working with to give people something actionable that they could try to do to work through grief?
No, mostly I would recommend some books that had the homework in it, but I didn't have any self-designed ones, that I designed.
Mm-hmm. Turn my mic on for a second. Hey guys, in case you weren't able to hear me on Mitch's laptop, I'm trying to keep the mic off because we're in the same room and the feedback about ran us out of here earlier. But if y'all have any questions for Dr. Killinan while we have the next 10 or 20 minutes to pick his brain, please drop questions in the chat and I'll relay them to him. You mentioned earlier about finding a balance between not creating a shrine and over memorializing and also not hiding from memories and experiences. Have you seen or encountered any ways of memorializing or celebrating someone's life that you thought were particularly impactful or hit you as like, huh, that's neat, I wouldn't have thought of that?
Yeah, with our son, we lived in Boston for 4 years where I did my graduate work. And he was an avid sports fan of the Boston Celtics and the Bruins and Red Sox. Some people called him Boston Nut Killinan. And there was a player named Reggie Lewis who played for the Celtics. And he died suddenly of heart failure. He was back home in Baltimore, in the projects where he grew up. And they developed a foundation for Reggie. And so Mitchell ordered a copy of Reggie's jersey that hung in his closet on his wall. And we've kept that. And in fact, Reggie's widow called me one day and said, "Your son's been sending money to the foundation. We're going to retire his jersey. Would you like to fly up to Boston? We'll fly your whole family up, put you up in the Marriott, and take you to the game." And we did. So if there are things, and he likes soccer a lot, if there are some things that your loved ones appreciated, maybe it's their favorite TV show or a book, uh, just don't build a shrine around all of it. But I think it's okay and even healthy uh, to do something like that.
Can you speak to whether it was personal experiences or professional experiences with clients, any advice or insight into the grieving process when the relationship that the person had with their loved one wasn't good? You know, if there was conflict between them prior to their death, or maybe they were uh, estranged, can you speak to how that can impact the process, either as an individual or a clinician trying to guide someone through it?
That's a very difficult one to deal with. Uh, and I would add to that. Uh, well, let me just deal with that. I don't think there's any closure for the remaining person if they just leave that stagnant like they have. So at times I've encouraged people uh, who haven't resolved that relationship. Uh, I said, go to the grave. It's a sacred place. And this sounds kind of voodoo, and talk with them about your feelings. And if it's anger, you can't forgive them, talk about that so that you can have closure.
One of our attendees, Mary Knight, asked, "What are signs or symptoms of pathological grief?"
Well, there was a family in our church whose daughter died suddenly, and her mother, I, got into what I call hysterical grief, which is okay in the early days and hours, but that went on for weeks and months and months and months. And then signs of depression, of deep depression, or a person can't function. Uh, all of those are kind of telltale signs that more is needed.
Have you had an opportunity or had any exposure to the Warden model of grief, Warden's task of mourning?
No, but that sounds intriguing to me.
Okay. Uh, I've, I've heard some of the other grief experts that I know talk about it and compare it to the Kubler-Ross model. I think it's developed under different circumstances and different like population to look at rather than people who are dying themselves. Just curious. Dr. Killinan, I don't see any more questions in the chat. Do you have any closing thoughts or bits of wisdom you'd like to share with us in
No, just
85 years of tending to people?
no. I want to go back where we started about the Mental Health America needing funding help. These televangelists would always say at the close of the service, the teleconference, teleservice, send those cards and letters in, meaning put a check in them. I'll leave you with that.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I am going to say, as a representative of MHA Spartanburg, we appreciate your attendance. We cannot guarantee any miracles in exchange for receipt of cards, but I appreciate the plug, Dr. K. We hope that everyone will join us for our education series when we pick back up in January. January will be a virtual event like today. We're hoping to start with our hybrid model in March. Dr. Killinan, thank you again for joining us and being gracious enough to spend some time with me and the attendees today, especially given that your wife recently had a fall. I hope she continues to heal well. And yeah, thank you everybody else. If you have any questions or concerns about today's event, you're welcome to email me at info@mhaspartanburg.org, which you can also find on our website. And stay tuned for our upcoming events and offerings. Thanks, everybody.